Liya Thachil, thank you so much for being with us here on ITV Gold. I know you're joining us here from New York City. I hope you're doing well and staying well.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
I have you here to discuss a lot on what's happening in today's social climate, especially since the untimely and very sad death of George Floyd and the outrage that we have seen across the nation as well as in many parts of the world. Today I have you here to discuss how that relates to the South Asian community and the issues that we face in terms of anti-Blackness or racism and a lot more. So just beginning this interview with you, Liya, could you explain what anti-Blackness is? And when we're looking at the South Asian community, how is this impacting us? And how is it sort of, not helping the cause, perhaps, of Black Lives Matter?
Great. I want to start at the very beginning, and which that is, let's define what anti-Blackness is. I recently read this wonderful New York Times article, and the author so very powerfully put it, and anti-Blackness in a sentence is the inability to recognize Black humanity. And to break it down even further, it means it's the inability within us to see Black people as humans. So when we see the murder of George Floyd, where a white police officer thought nothing of keeping his neck and using his body weight to suffocate a Black man for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, we're seeing a glaring example of anti-Blackness because he didn't see George Floyd's humanity in that moment. He just saw a Black man. And to him, that didn't equate as a human. So if I were to give you a more academic definition, I'd like to quote a Malayali American professor, Professor Thomas George, who says that anti-Blackness is both the covert and overt, also the institutional and interpersonal racism that negatively affects the health, the wealth, and the safety of African Americans. What this really means is that African Americans consistently in this country, they are not safe. They cannot garner wealth like we can. They cannot ensure their health the same way we can. They're already born into this country facing unequal odds. And I say this all to say is that it's so deeply ingrained within us as a country, this anti-Blackness. It's within our systems. Just to read a few stats, 90% of the wealth in this country is concentrated with white people. The income gap between a Black household and a white household is roughly the same today as it was in 1970. So when we look at history, in 1965 is when the Civil Rights Act, 1964 is when the Civil Rights Act passed. And that's when African American people were finally given equal rights in this country. But when we look at the whole of history, for 250 years, African American people were enslaved in this country. And then for 100 years after that, when they were emancipated from slavery, they were then faced with Jim Crow laws, which led to segregation. And then it was only in 1965 that they even got full equal rights and the ability to vote. So when we look at all of that, in the entire history of this country, Black people really have only had equal rights, and I put that in quote because, as we know, they don't get to enjoy those equal rights to the same extent as others in our society for about 56 years. That's a very short time frame, right? So there's a lot of work to be done to sort of dismantle anti-Blackness in our country and in our institution. When you look at the stats, just maternal mortality rates in this country, Black mothers are 3.5 times more likely to die during childbirth than white mothers. There's about 13% of the American population is African American men, but they make up 40% of our prison population. There's mass incarceration, there's unhealthy standards that they're all facing. And it is part of the institution, and it's very difficult for us to sort of confront it, but we have to, especially the South Asian community. What, we fail to recognize is our own history in this country. Most South Asian Americans came to this country in 1965 or post 1965, all due to one piece of legislation, which was the Immigration Act of 1965. Right. My family was a direct beneficiary of this law. A lot of families can trace back their beginnings in this country to this law, and it was specifically passed to allow highly educated or highly skilled South Asian Americans into this country. And it was only allowed because of the civil rights movement. What a lot of people don't even know is that South Asians have been in America since the 1800s. There's been documented Punjabi immigrants, traders, people that came in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And in the 1920s, the American population was really, really troubled by the presence of South Asians in their country. It was so troubled to the point that it passed the Immigration Act of 1917, which, and I would like to quote it verbatim, said that Indians and those of Indian descent were deemed undesirable to achieve American citizenship. Wow. It was a piece of legislation in this country, which you can look up on any, forum. But that is, in and of itself, shows that we weren't wanted here. We weren't wanted here until we served a purpose. And that's what the Immigration Act of 1965 did. It gave us a purpose. So it brought over highly skilled engineers, highly skilled doctors. My mom came because of the nursing shortage that this country experienced during the 70s, 80s, as did my husband's aunt, and by them coming and then chain migration, they were able to bring their families over. It was all designed, right? It was especially designed. But when we came here in 1965, we came here being able to exercise our full rights. We never experienced segregation. You and I both didn't. Our parents didn't. They don't know what that's like. And the only reason that they didn't is because Black people took it upon themselves to do that fight and get equality for all people of color, not just themselves. So we have a huge duty and obligation as a community to support African American people and to understand their plight. Our country was colonized by the British for 200 years. We were looted. Our resources were taken. I mean, tea was taken from us, pepper, textiles. A lot of things were taken from us from the British. So we should understand more acutely how it feels for an African American who came to this country not by choice. Right. They were brought here as slaves. Their ancestors were brought here against their will. They were torn away from their homes. We know what it's like to live in our motherland as second-class citizens. My grandparents remember what that was like. Our great-grandparents, most of our grandparents can tell us about British Raj, and they know how terrible it was. So we have a history of understanding, oppression, and it is our job to, fight for that.
Let me ask you something just relating that. Then how would you sort of describe systemic racism and its relation to anti-Blackness? Because this big topic has definitely been seen throughout the media right now in the last 2 weeks. There has been a call to end systemic racism. Just racism in general has become such a big topic of discussion across the world. How important is it for us to understand that this is taking place right now in 2020, and you can actually relate it to our history and also the issue of anti-Blackness? I'd love to get your opinion on that.
Sure. So systemic racism essentially is talking about policies that prevent equality. So there are very clear policies, and I'm going to use the police as an example, as to why there is systemic racism. Essentially, the way the structure of our institutions have been made, it skews the ability of African Americans to be on equal footing. So when we look at the rates at which African American people are killed by the police, just to name more stats, I'm a stats gal, what can I say? From 2013 to 2019, 1,840 Black people have been killed by the police.
Yeah.
Of the police that have committed this murder, these acts, only 1% have received any punishment. That means 99% of the cops that killed unarmed Black people faced no consequences. And that is due to a policy. That is due to protocol and systems that don't take into account that this level of brutality, this level of violence is not necessary. And that's ingrained in their institution. Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by the police. And that is irrelevant of their background, if they are educated, if they are a doctor, if they are, honestly, I always like to say the safest Black man in America is President Barack Obama, and that's because he has Secret Service.
Wow.
When you think about it, no Black person is exempt. They are all seen as targets, and that is because the institutions teach and train their officers to see them as targets. Most Black people live in heavily urban areas like New York City, the Bronx. These areas have 3 times more police patrolling. There's more cops per capita in those areas, which allow for more crimes or small incidents to be observed by the police, which allows for more face-offs between the police and minority communities to happen. This over-policing is also a policy that is racist and is providing inequality towards Black people. So systemic racism is so strong in all of our institutions, and it will require a lot of reform. And it's reform that's uncomfortable for people to talk about. When you think of a police officer, as a brown woman, I'm not scared of the police. I would imagine you're not either. If you felt like you were in danger and if you felt like someone broke into your home, you and I wouldn't think twice about calling the cops.
Yeah.
Guess what? Black people think twice about calling the cops. The murder of Breonna Taylor, an EMT who did nothing, whose home was mistaken for another home that had an intruder, was shot 8 times by the cops. She was unarmed. She didn't do anything. She wasn't even the intended destination. But this policy of shoot now, ask questions later has to end. And that is a true manifestation of systemic racism. And that's why that conversation is so prevalent now, because people all are asking, how did this officer think it was okay to do this to George Floyd? Well, the answer is because he was trained to do so. And he was trained to think that this isn't a problem. So that's why that topic is so prevalent, and we have to confront it. There's a lot of work to be done in that space.
Do you believe then these protests, these demonstrations, and I'm not talking about looting and rioting, because I think that's a very specific, group of people, and I don't think the majority of the, demonstrators really represent that. Do you think that actually is helping in getting this reform closer to possibly a new bill, a new legislature? I guess my question is, what is sort of required here in terms of a change in the institution? And perhaps how can we all help make that change happen even faster?
Right. This is a great question. So first and foremost, protesting works. Just in 1 week of sustained protesting, peaceful protesting, they were able to not only get the officer who committed the crime finally charged, they got his crime to be properly charged. They got the 3 officers that witnessed all of this happen and backed up this police officer also charged. So that's one. They forced Minneapolis, I'm sorry, to take drastic steps in attempting police reform. They announced 2 days ago that they will be reshuffling their budgets and moving a bulk of the police budgets to social services and providing more assistance on that level versus investing more equipment and things into their police department. They're going to focus more on training and education and social services. So that's a very powerful move that was achieved by the protest. I work for the New York State Senate, and the murder of George Floyd didn't even happen in our state, but in response to activists who took to the streets of Brooklyn and Manhattan and the Bronx, we passed historic legislation that banned chokeholds for police. Up until this point, the police were allowed to choke people. It banned, the use of excessive force. It requires police intervention. So your partner needs to intervene if you're about to shoot someone and it's not called for. Police in general have always worked on this sort of oath of brotherhood that, like, I'm your ride or die. I will protect you even if you're wrong because you're my brother kind of concept. And that law repealed that. And then we also repealed 50A, which is so critical because police in this country have been able to operate without any transparency. There's a lot of hush-hush culture. There's a lot of secrecy. And you were never able to find out if a police officer had a record of excessive violence. And 50A repeals that protection and demands transparency in our police force. So that's just 1 week of protest, right? That's just 1 week of outrage, of people making their message clear that enough is enough. We need change. Now, the protests will end, as all protests do. We can't do this indefinitely. Nobody has the resources and times. To create true permanent change, we need legislation. That's the only way to do it. And I tend to harp about this a lot on my platform, but I truly believe it. We are now in 2020. It is the most critical election cycle of our country's history, one could argue. It's not just the presidency that's up for grab, but Congress is up for grabs. State legislatures are up for grabs. Mayors are up for grabs. Every layer of government is now going to be up for re-election. And now we as a people have the opportunity to use our vote as our voice to say, we will only support leaders that want true change, that will support these policies that people have been fighting long and hard for, and that we will no longer accept another George Floyd, another Breonna Taylor. We must have permanent change. And that requires electing progressive leaders into these offices that can make that happen. People think the federal government is responsible for a lot of police policies, school policies. That's not true. It's your local government. All of us have school boards that set school policies that, monitor things like hairstyles that are allowed. Statistically, school policies tend to discriminate against African American children's hairstyles. They have different hair than us, and so they need to have certain types of protective hairstyles that they can wear, and that's deemed as unprofessional and not allowed. There was that video that circulated of that African-American student who was a wrestler who was forced to have his dreadlocks or his braids cut off before a meet because it didn't, comply to their standards, and that's a fail in policy. And if they had properly elected school board members, which are just people from your neighborhood, then they would have been able to address that. So this is the time for us to civically engage. It's the time for us to exercise that right to vote that we only have, like I said, and I may sound like a broken box, but I think it's important to reiterate that we only have because of Black people and their sacrifice. So we do ourselves a disservice, we do our community a disservice if we don't, vote and if we don't engage in this election, because this is where we're gonna do the real change.
It is so highly important to vote and advocate that voice. We continuously keep on promoting that on ITV Gold because South Asians tend to not vote as much, and the Asian American community is always voting less in most of the elections. So we're really trying to push our community here, towards that and raise more awareness. I still have just one or two questions left here. I would love for you to give a response after everything that you've discussed with us. There is a different side to it. There is, opposition to this as well. There are people that are claiming, why don't all lives matter? Why is it so necessary to focus on the fact that Black lives matter? I would love for you to give a response to that if possible.
Sure. I'm going to use a very common analogy that I'm seeing across news cycles and social media from Black leaders, and that is the burning house analogy. So if you live on a block, there's a block of 5 houses, George's house is on fire. You and your neighbors are going to run to George and help him. But if Karen, whose house is also on the block, comes out of her house and says, "Why are you all helping George? All of our houses matter," we would all stop and look at her and be like, "But George's house is on fire. He's going to lose his home. Your house is fine. You don't need our help right now." But then she could be like, "Well, my house could be on fire. I could be having issues. I could be having problems, but you're not. You're fine. You're good. George's house is on fire. George needs our help." Likewise, to the people that say all lives matter, yes, all lives do matter. And I wish we lived in a world where that was inherently true. Unfortunately, we have enough evidence and we've seen enough footage to know that African American lives, they're dying in this country. They're dying, and nothing, education, high paying jobs, nothing will save them except for true policy change. And they require unity from all of us, and they require our support in order to achieve that. We don't have the same experiences as African American people in this country, but as minority people, if they could come for us, we're not exempt from all of this. I don't know if you remember the case of the Indian grandfather in Alabama, Suresh Bhai Patel, in 2015.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't know this, but the police were called by a white neighbor who suspected of seeing a skinny Black man. In the audio recording of the 911 call, she didn't identify him as a brown man. She identified him as a Black man. And that is why the cops pulled up to him, no questions asked, and slammed him to the ground and paralyzed him for life. All because they thought it was a Black man, not because they thought it was a brown man. So it could happen to my brother, it could happen to my husband. They could be mistaken for a Black person, and their life could be at risk. That's just a reality. And we don't confront that because South Asian Americans, we have a lot of privilege in this country, and we've achieved a lot in this country. This country has given us a lot of opportunities. And we feel as though we are obligated to keep our head down and not speak up and be grateful for all of these opportunities and be grateful that we are not the recipients of these problems, But, we have all of this because of other people's sacrifices, and those people are dying. So how could we not, step up and support them? That's the whole point of this movement. It's not about, saying that Black people are better than everyone. No, it's just trying to say that Black people deserve to live just as much as the rest of us. And that's the true meaning of the movement. And unfortunately, there's a lot of work to be done in our own communities to sort of dismantle that. Our culture, unfortunately, comes from colorism, where we feel as though darker skin is inferior. And we come from casteism that innately sets a hierarchy in society that says innately that not all people are equal. Some people are definitely better than others. We have a lot of dismantling to do within our own communities, and it requires a lot of uncomfortable conversations, and it requires a lot of confrontation of our elders, of our peers, that, it's going to be tough, it's going to be rough, but when I see the amount of solidarity and I see the amount of people finally realizing, wow, we have to do our part, it does make me feel very hopeful for the future, because there has been so many people mobilizing in all the individual South Asian communities. I mean, I'll give myself as an example. I'm a Malayali American. And for the first time, my community is finally saying, oh, wait, we actually need to do something. And we've mobilized, we've created a group called Malayalis for Black Lives Matter, and we've committed to doing the work on tackling these issues. And it's so important that people come together and do that. And, we lean on each other for that support, because it's not going to be easy, but it's what we need to do.
Leah, this was such a great conversation, because I think it's so important that at this time, the biggest responsibility of South Asian community is perhaps to just learn and educate themselves and have those conversations and understand our own history and also what's happening here. My last question to you is a little bit different. You have a very strong social media presence. You have lots of followers and fans. I would love for you to give a message out to them. A lot of them are keeping up with your activities right now. They're commenting on it, and you've really utilized your platform to advocate. And I truly appreciate that. So a little message out to, all of your supporters. I think that'd be great to end the interview on.
Oh man, I feel like Beyonce. I didn't know I had fans. Thank you. That's so kind of you to say. I had to take a minute during all of this to really assess what I will be using my platform for. And up until this point, it's been my sort of creative outlet. My real life is in politics and policy making, but I've kind of hid that from my social media side. I've kind of focused on my second love, which is fashion, and which is what I did to pay for school and what I worked in before I got back into politics full time. And I just realized that, I have a responsibility, and people like me who are committed to building a platform and building an audience have a real deep responsibility to advocate for causes that matter and to use our platform for a greater good. And all my message will be from here till the end of time is that please understand your power. People believe that, their voice isn't going to matter, their vote isn't going to matter, that even if they share something, that's not going to do anything. There's this sort of deep cynicism and this sort of deep fatalism I kept seeing amongst my peers, amongst my followers that were sharing things. And it really, really made me feel very sad. And I realized that this is because we've been told we don't matter. This has been because we've been told our voice only matters when we have X amount of followers or X amount of things under our belt. But that's not true. The power of an individual's voice collectively standing together is so loud that you can't ever think that it doesn't matter. So please try and do one small thing that you believe is going to make a difference, and keep doing that one small thing. It doesn't need to be a grand thing. Just remember that your voice matters, and we need to hear it now more than ever.